Hello. No, I'm not Clyde Phillymore, but I am to some degree his alter ego, John Hampton, author and self-publisher of Aggravation, Life's Full of It, of which Clyde happens to be the main character, along with his new best friend Sandy Harold Merriweather. And the purpose of this video is to promote my novel by reading excerpts from it. And hopefully, after liking what you hear, you can log on to my website, johnsbooksasp.com.au, buy the novel, and in doing so read the book in its entirety. Fill in the gaps, so to speak. You won't be disappointed. Now, before I begin reading one of four, the other three on separate episodes, I'll give you a brief synopsis. Clyde, 64, fed up with the aggravating noise of city life, moves to the small New South Wales country town of Welcome to escape it, only to find he is plagued by the same noise. But of course. Nevertheless, he has bought a house, MacArthur House, that once belonged to now deceased twin sisters Harriet and Henrietta MacArthur. And before too long, the sisters begin to haunt him. The haunting eventually leading Clyde to discover their diaries, the contents of which are beyond Clyde's wildest imaginations. And so it begins with one thing leading to another and onto something else, all of which are outer-worldly. Sound interesting? You betcha. I'll begin my reading page 45, second paragraph. It won't take too long, a few minutes is all, 5 tops. So please, sit back, relax, close your eyes if you wish. Sometimes it's better that way. At this point, Clyde has been a resident of Welcome 7 months, and at this time has not experienced the haunting. That begins page 95. So what I'm about to read gives you an insight as to how Clyde feels in his new chosen way of life. When he walks the main street of Welcome, very few locals recognise him, and those that do rarely greet him with any more than a muffled hello or a nod of the head. Clyde likes that. He also always reciprocates because it's the polite thing to do. But other than that, he is content to keep to himself. Perhaps the locals feel the same way. Living all of his life close to Sydney, he had always been just another face among the teeming proliferation of people that frequented the streets any time, day or night. A virtual nobody. He had always liked that too. His uncle, a man who had spent most of his adulthood on the land, had once said that in his hometown he was somebody, but in the city he ceased to exist. Clyde didn't know if his uncle liked that or not, or if that feeling of being just another face in the crowd made his hometown seem all that more homely. Clyde is familiar with the proprietors and staff of the shops he regularly patronises in Welcome: supermarket, newsagent, butcher, pharmacy, hardware, bakery, post office, the service station, where he purchases petrol and has his car serviced, and of course the cafe. But the publicans and staff of the 2 pubs, and the managers and staff of the bowling and golf clubs, he doesn't know at all. Wouldn't know them if he fell over them in the street. Nor does he know any of the patrons, except perhaps for Sandy Merriweather, Bob Lawrence, Louise Mapleton, and of course Charlie Jessup and the Curtises, that so often frequent those 4 establishments. Besides the smell of stale beer and cigarette smoke, places like those were always noisy, and Clyde didn't like the constant babble of voices which, more often than not, were raised in order to be heard over the noises those voices were responsible for in the first place. Clyde couldn't understand what those people found so interesting to talk so incessantly about so often. Clyde was basically a self-educated individual who was more than capable of holding his own with anyone on just about any subject. But he doubted those who imbibed it on a daily basis had the capacity to discuss local and world events. So what the hell did they talk about? Once comments were made concerning the weather and the effects it was or was not having on the pastures and crops, the well-being of each other, that the inquirer didn't really care about one way or the other. Their feelings regarding their favourite football team's latest win or loss, The ousting of a particular person from the latest reality or cooking show, and who will pay for the next round of drinks. What was left for them to go on about, on and on and on? It was a conundrum to Clyde, and quite honestly, he didn't care. After all, one man's meat, another man's poison. And who was he to criticise the choice of others? And besides, he hadn't moved to the country to begin a social life. Good God, no, and may heaven forbid. And the fewer friends he made, the better. No, he had moved to the country to isolate himself from as many people as possible, and away from the noise of the city that had begun to take its toll. He was 65 now. Not old by today's standard, but 6 months ago he had felt every year of his 64 years. But now 65 was but a number. The air he breathed was sweeter than any air he had ever breathed. The water cleaner than any water he had ever drank. The warmth from the open fire unlike any other he had ever experienced. Food tasted better, and the tea he brewed from tank water had a taste the likes of which he had never known. He slept better, awoke feeling refreshed like he did when a child, was more relaxed within himself, and was enjoying the simple things that life had to offer that hadn't been on offer before. Like looking at the stars at night. In the city you could only see the brightest of stars because of the veil of artificial light. But in the country the night sky was a vision splendid. So many stars that at times it dazzled Clyde's eyes, seemingly so close on occasion that he could reach up and touch them. A wonderful illusion that as yet he hasn't taken for granted and tired of. He doubts that he ever will. The full moon, so close at times, it was as if the earth and its satellite had half the distance between each other. The sound of the rain on the corrugated iron roof that lulled and reassured that all was well in that particular small part of a country that was the driest on the face of the planet. The earthy smell of damp soil carried on the wind, the news that the rain was falling on an elsewhere somewhere in the distant, near or far, that refreshed and invigorated. Then there was the fishing. Clyde had never imagined himself, let alone getting immense satisfaction from it. But he did and was. There was no doubt in his mind that sharing those times with Sandy had a lot to do with it. But even those times he did so alone he enjoyed. He always kept an eye out for his newfound friend. So much the better when he was around. But alone or not, it was the expectation of what might come, and the not knowing when the line went tight, if it was perhaps the fish of the day and the one that didn't get away. Most of the time, like it was with Sandy, he landed carp, but on one occasion a good-sized yellow belly. Be 3 pounds if it's an ounce, or I'm named Sandy Harold Merriweather. Twice a catfish, not a bad-looking fish and damn good eating, but you gotta be careful of them barbs. 3 times a turtle. Damn bloody nuisance those bloody things are. And the one that did get away. Good God Almighty, Clyde. That was a cod, it was. Could tell by the tail, I'll be damned if it wasn't. But besides the fishing, there was always the promise of catching a feed of tasty crustaceans that are common to inland waters and farm dams. Want to make yourself a yabby trap, Sandy had suggested. I usually bring mine along, unless I forget. Good as anything you can buy, those yabbies is. Good as lobster and crab, and they don't cost a penny. Not a goddamn razoo. They don't. I usually put a good-sized piece of them on them dog bones you can buy from the butcher, or a cake of Sunlight soap if you haven't got around to the butcher. To use carp flesh too if you want to, but it stinks to high heaven after a while underwater. The meat smells too, but not anywhere like that carp flesh. Enough to turn your stomach good and proper, it is. Sandy goes on to tell Clyde how to make himself a yabby trap and what sort of bait he uses and so on. So I won't bore you with that at this particular time. I'll just continue on to how Clyde feels in a particular area close to Welcome. Time spent in Welcome State Forest were particularly rewarding to Clyde. 15 minutes by car and he entered a vast area of 8,000 hectares of isolation and quiet, except for the odd rifle shot that wasn't available on a conscious level outside that of a soundproof room or a padded cell. Not that Clyde had ever been in a padded cell. He would have ended up in one if he'd remained in Glebe. To that there was no doubt. Sometimes the quiet was a little overwhelming, particularly around the area of Tor Hill, so named, although Clyde can't figure out why it was named Tor, T-O-R and not T-A-W, but Clyde simply shrugs it off, because of the large marble-like granite rocks at the top. Clyde hasn't ventured to the top as yet, but he plans to in the not too distant future. The hill, according to the topographical map he purchased from the newsagent, rises 165 metres, which makes it just shy of being a mountain. Clyde reckons it'll feel like a mountain by the time he reaches the top after what must be a 45-degree incline leading all the way. Not a walk in the park, it isn't. He can't help but wonder if the MacArthur sisters had ever scaled the hill, or even if they had commenced a dig in search of the pyramid they were convinced was buried under it. Common sense tells him it's nothing but a fanciful notion, but his other senses tell him a different story, that there is something strange and eerie about the hill and its immediate surroundings. Supernatural perhaps not, but weird nevertheless. He can feel it. Are you game enough to come here at night is a question he has asked himself every time he visits the locality, but as yet he hasn't been able to answer. Perhaps it's the isolation that, for a few daylight hours, is a wonderful thing to experience. But for a man city-born and raised, too much isolation, especially at night, might prove to be too much for him to bear. And perhaps he fears fear itself, a rational state of mind, but an irrational hypothesis. He keeps telling himself that there is nothing here during the day that isn't here at night, and he would be safer here at night than he would be in Bishop Park. But still he hesitates. And he knows there isn't a boogeyman or predator waiting to prey upon him, just harmless creatures that go bump in the night. And he is, after all, a grown man and not a boy, so surely he is well past being haunted by the monsters that once lurked in his head and the pulling up of his bed covers because of them. But still he waits. There is no signal for his mobile phone here. Reason enough for one of age not to venture into the unknown. Or so he keeps reminding himself. Are you game enough, Clyde, to admit that there's only one reason holding you back? One reason that you don't want to admit to because you think it's silly and beyond all reason? The one thing you've heard about so often happening to so many around the world that could only be a figment of their deluded imaginations. Alien abduction. Isn't that what you're afraid of? Ever since you heard the words sightings and UFOs come out of Bob Lawrence's mouth, you've wondered if perhaps the sisters weren't as nutty as fruitcakes the way people had made them out to be. That where there's smoke, there's bound to be fire, sooner or later. Wasn't that the reason you didn't buy acreage out of town? Acreage that would have guaranteed peace and quiet far removed from those people and their infernal noise and all the other noise that aggravate you so. Isn't it, Clyde? Isn't it? Safety in numbers is the reason you decide to live in town. To be able to see lights that are man-made rather than those of unknown origin. So reassuring as opposed to the intangible. Are you game enough, Clyde? Are you talking over Sandy? He who has his feet planted firmly on the ground and hasn't seen anything stranger than his neighbour here in rollers wearing a mud pack but believes what he doesn't want to believe because it must be true. Angels or aliens? Take your pick. True or false? 6 of one and half a dozen the other. But not the same. Clyde keeps reminding himself that he must ask his friend for his opinion. If for no other reason than to confide in someone he knows will listen. After all, confession is good for the soul.